Hey there, art nerds. Today, I'd like to walk you through the process of creating a bokeh background effect like the one shown here. This was my Marie's master level field test, and I wanted to try out some cool wet into wet techniques, and I want to share how I did them with you guys. If you guys are interested in how I felt about these watercolors, make sure you check the description below. I will have links for you guys. Otherwise, let's go ahead and get started. When you're creating a bokeh effect like we're doing with this wet into wet, you do want watercolors that have a decent amount of flow or oxgall added to them because we do want the colors to mix and flow together. I'm going to start by using a large mop to apply a lot of water to this cotton rag paper. I am using Arches for this example, but any cotton rag paper that has a good amount of sizing and allows for lifting and some reactivating will work well for this. I mean, you want a lot of water for these misty wet into wet blends. This technique was inspired by what I learned from doing one of Sarah Cray's watercolor kits. It's not the exact technique, but it's somewhat similar, and it's one that I've experimented with on the channel before. So while the water is on my paper, I am creating several puddles of color. So I wanted something that felt kind of little golden book inspired, the more vintagey ones. I guess you could say I'm getting to be more vintagey. So I'm creating several puddles starting from a cool yellow and working my way around to a blue. And these are going to be helpful because once we start adding color, we want to kind of add our color quickly. We don't want to have to be mixing color. We don't want to have to be grabbing color. If your paper dries, go ahead and re-wet it some. So once you've got some sizable pools of watercolor that are just ready for you to pick up, I'm going to use a large, this is a flat, you don't have to use a flat, but I do find that it works kind of well. And I'm doing what I think of as kind of like a sun ray pattern. So it's kind of a diagonal pattern across the page. You could do stripes going any which way. You could do a more mottled sort of undersea look, but I think the diagonal works really well. And I'm just kind of working those strips of color into the water, wet into wet, very loosely, very quickly. This is why you're going to want a watercolor that has a lot of flow to it, or you might want to add some oxgall to your watercolor. I'm also going for something that I can paint on top of, so something that's going to result in a more pastel watercolor. I'm even working in a little of the blue here so that we get some, more mottled, darker tones so that it's not just like neon green. And it is going to kind of disperse onto the paper. That's why it's really important to work on a watercolor paper that does have some sizing, it does have some structure, but it can really accept water and will really allow wet into wet. Now I have wrapped a paper towel around, I think it's a small glass jar. It's the little glass jar that I use for masking fluid. And I'm just pressing it against the still damp paper and blotting it up. And this is what's going to create our bokeh effect. And since the paper is so wet, it is going to pull that color back into the area that we blotted. So these are not going to be like really perfect, crispy circles. They're going to be softer, more diffuse circles. You can use that to your advantage. You can also use circular shapes of any size. Like some people use coins for this. I found the little jar a little bit easier because it gives me some distance. So now I have wrapped it around a larger glass jar bottom, you guys can see, and I'm just kind of using it like a stamp to pick up some of the water. And I thought having a few different sizes of jars would make for a more interesting bokeh effect and make for a more interesting lift. The real key to getting this technique to work this way is working while the watercolor is still wet. Whether you've applied watercolor to a dry page and the watercolor itself is wet, or you applied it to a wet page and everything is still wet. For it to really lift, you want to work with it while it's still wet. I'm using Viva paper towels for this because they don't have an abrasive or an assertive texture, but you can use one that has a texture if you're looking for a textural effect, like something a little bit more broken up. I allowed that to dry completely, and then I resaturated it with water, and I'm going in and creating another layer. So that's another trick to this bokeh effect, is creating layers and creating depth and working in more saturated color in some areas, lifting things out more or less in some areas. So really, this is going to be your discretion, your taste, what you like, where you want these things to be picked up. So the best advice I can give you is to kind of look at the flow of your illustration and what you want to accomplish with that, and apply your strokes and apply your bokeh in a way that really best suits your composition or suits the sort of story that you're trying to tell. If you want a more assertive bokeh effect, the way you can make it more assertive is to work with more saturated colors. Don't water them down so much. Don't go for so much pastel, and they will appear more assertive, because when you lift that up, there's going to be more contrast between the color and what was lifted up. On a good cotton rag paper, you can also do this for several layers. Apply, allow to dry, and then lift up. Apply, allow to dry, and then lift up. And if you're working with the right kind of watercolors, you shouldn't see a whole lot of reactivation once they're really into that watercolor paper. This is a really fun technique. It is absolutely perfect for doing dappled sunlight, or for creating kind of a underwater bubble effect, or just kind of giving things kind of a gentle, sort of mystical feeling. So for the final layer, I'm just going to add some more saturated color to the center of the illustration. I wanted it to have kind of a diffused effect, and I'm doing that through layering. So I'm working with much more saturated colors than you might expect, considering we're working with blues, greens, and yellows, and I'm just painting with abandon over faces and over these little chicks. And I can use the bokeh effect to just gently lift out. You can see how we're getting more contrast now. Since there's more saturated color, it's more noticeable, it's more visible, and you can just kind of lift it off of the faces this way, and that'll give it kind of like that lens flare sort of look, and I think it's just really cute. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me for this really short tutorial. If you guys want to watch me paint this in time lapse, you can find it in the Marie's Master Level Watercolor review. I'm hoping to kind of curate out more short tutorials on techniques that I think are really neat or really fun, and kind of explain those in more depth. So if you guys enjoyed that, let me know down in the comments. The suggestion to record some shorter, easier to digest tutorials was presented to me by one of my patrons. Thank you so much for the suggestion. I think it's a wonderful idea, and sometimes I need these kind of reminders. I know sometimes people like to put me on in the background and hang out with me while they clean or work on homework or do other tasks, and I absolutely love that. But I want the tutorials that I create to be accessible for a variety of people. So the reminder that I need to have some more digestible little tidbit tutorials was much appreciated. Thank you so much. And a big thanks to my patrons in general. You guys make tutorials like this one possible. Thank you guys so much.